Terence Whitaker had just finished mowing the front lawn of his own home when 3 police cars came racing down the quiet street. A neighbor had reported a suspicious man who appeared to be breaking into a mansion that did not belong to him. Nobody on that street seemed willing to believe that the tall black man standing in the yard, dressed in grass-stained work clothes, could possibly own the largest house on the block. Terence calmly set down his rake and wiped the sweat from his brow. He reached for the keys in his pocket, ready to prove exactly who he was. Even after he produced identification and the deed to the property, the officers stepped forward, forced his hands behind his back, and snapped cold metal handcuffs around his wrists on the steps of his own porch. For a moment, it seemed as though the humiliation would simply end there. Another quiet injustice, swallowed by an otherwise ordinary day. Then, a black military vehicle turned onto the street and stopped directly in front of the house. The man who stepped out was not a lawyer. I was not a bail bondsman. I was a military colonel who had come looking for Terence himself. Before any of that happened, almost nobody on Maple Ridge Lane knew very much about the quiet man living at number 14. Terence had been part of the neighborhood for some time, purchasing the large brick colonial with its wraparound porch using savings accumulated across decades of military service. He kept mostly to himself. He still woke before sunrise out of habit and tended his garden with the same discipline he had once used to keep a forward operating base running according to schedule. Terence repaired his own gutters. He fixed his own fence. He mowed his own lawn, rather than hiring the landscaping companies most of his wealthier neighbors used without giving it much thought. When an elderly widow living nearby needed help clearing her driveway after a snowstorm, Terence appeared before sunrise, carrying a shovel and a thermos of coffee. Afterward, he never mentioned what he had done. I was polite whenever someone spoke to him, but he rarely volunteered details about himself. Something about that reserve made certain people curious in ways that were not always kind. Terence almost never discussed his military career unless someone asked him directly. Even then, his answers remained brief and modest, revealing almost nothing about what he had actually done. Most of his neighbors assumed he had worked some ordinary job in the city, perhaps in logistics or maintenance. He usually wore plain clothes. He drove an unremarkable gray pickup truck. Nothing about his appearance suggested the extraordinary life he had lived. None of his neighbors knew that inside his home, in a small study rarely shown to visitors, photographs hung on the walls showing men in uniform standing together in deserts and mountains. Beside them were medals that told a story none of the people on Maple Ridge Lane would ever have imagined. In the garage, carefully folded and displayed with quiet pride, rested an American flag that had once flown over a military base where Terence had commanded soldiers through some of the most dangerous periods of his life. He kept the flag inside rather than displaying it in the front yard, not because he was ashamed, because humility had become instinctive to him. Terence understood something many soldiers learned through experience. True honor rarely needed to announce itself. To him, dignity was not something displayed for other people to admire. It was something a person carried quietly, just as he had always carried his duty. Terence had grown up in a small Ohio town. His mother worked exhausting shifts at a diner. His father had also spent many years in uniform, before an injury forced him to leave military service earlier than he had intended. From childhood, Terence had been taught that respect was earned through action rather than words. His father repeated that lesson so often that eventually it stopped sounding like advice. It simply became part of who Terence was. After finishing high school, he enlisted. He chose discipline and purpose instead of the uncertainty of a future he could not yet imagine. During the decades that followed, Terence steadily rose through the ranks, not because he was driven by ambition for its own sake. He advanced because the men and women serving around him repeatedly trusted his judgment during moments when judgment mattered most. His assignments took him far from home. He missed birthdays, holidays, the ordinary family milestones other people often took for granted. By the time Terence finally removed his uniform for the last time, he had devoted more of his life to service than most people ever devoted to anything. And he carried that history into retirement exactly as he carried everything else, quietly, without complaint. Unfortunately, not everyone on Maple Ridge Lane returned his courtesy with equal respect. A retired accountant, who lived across the street frequently, watched Terence work in his yard with a suspicious squint. He occasionally muttered to his wife that something about the man seemed wrong, although he could never explain exactly what he meant. A younger couple living nearby sometimes crossed the street whenever they saw Terence approaching. They offered him stiff nods rather than the warm greetings they readily gave to other neighbors. Terence noticed. Of course he did. A man who had spent decades learning to read the mood of a room did not fail to recognize suspicion when it was aimed directly at him. He remembered similar looks from much earlier in his life, moments scattered across his childhood and young adulthood, when strangers decided who he was before hearing him speak. Those experiences taught Terence an important lesson. Anger rarely changed anything, and the people most certain of their own judgment were usually the hardest to persuade through argument. Over the years, he had developed a quiet kind of armor, a steadiness that allowed suspicion and insults to pass without leaving visible marks. Even when they did leave marks, Terence rarely allowed anyone to see them. It was not indifference, it was survival, refined through experience into something resembling grace. He had hoped Maple Ridge Lane might represent a different chapter of his life. Perhaps a middle-aged man with a well-maintained home and a peaceful routine might finally be judged simply by what he did, rather than by how he looked while doing it. Terence never complained about the treatment. He simply continued mowing his grass, repairing his fence, waving politely at neighbors who refused to wave back. It was another private test of patience, one he had encountered in many different forms throughout his life. Terence had long ago decided that dignity meant refusing to allow somebody else's fear to change the person he chose to be. Even so, an undercurrent of suspicion had been growing along Maple Ridge Lane. It was simply waiting for a spark. That spark came when Laurel Benson, a woman who had recently moved into the house next door, looked through her kitchen window and saw Terence working in his front yard. She barely knew him. Their only real interaction had been a brief introduction at her housewarming, where Terence had politely declined an invitation to stay longer. Yet Laurel had already begun constructing an entire story in her mind about who her neighbor might be. She saw a large black man dressed in worn clothing moving confidently around a home she assumed was far too expensive for someone like him. Rather than walking outside and asking a simple question, Laurel reached for her phone. She called the police. She described a suspicious individual who appeared to be attempting to break into a house. She carefully included details that made Terence sound like a stranger rather than the resident. When Laurel ended the call, she believed she had performed a civic duty. It never occurred to her that she might have just set into motion a chain of events that would humiliate an innocent man directly outside his own home. Police vehicles soon turned onto Maple Ridge Lane. Officer Grant Hollis arrived first, followed closely by other patrol cars. Emergency lights flashed across the quiet suburban homes as neighbors began stepping onto their porches to watch. Hollis approached Terrence with one hand resting close to his belt. He ordered Terrence to raise his hands where the officers could see them. Terrence immediately complied. He placed his rake on the ground and lifted both hands into the open air without hesitation. His voice remained calm and controlled. It was the same tone he had once used to steady frightened young soldiers during dangerous situations. Terrence explained plainly that the property belonged to him. He lived there. The officers exchanged skeptical looks. His explanation did not match the picture already forming in their minds. That picture had been shaped more by Laurel's frightened telephone call than by anything Terrence had actually done. One officer questioned why a homeowner would be dressed the way Terrence was dressed. He wore an old, faded t-shirt. His work boots were covered in grass. To the officer, the clothing did not seem appropriate for someone wealthy enough to own a house like this. Terrence offered a small, patient smile. I explained that he had simply been mowing his own lawn, something he routinely did himself. A rookie officer named Sierra Delgado studied Terrence more carefully than the others. She noticed something her colleagues appeared to be overlooking. There was a practiced calm in the way Terrence carried himself, discipline in his posture, no panic, no defensiveness in his voice. To Sierra, those qualities suggested training rather than guilt. She quietly suggested that the officers slow down and verify Terrence's explanation before taking further action. Her superior dismissed the concern. People breaking into homes, he argued, always came prepared with convincing stories. Terrence slowly reached into his pocket, carefully controlling every movement so that nobody would interpret it as a threat. He produced his keys, his wallet, his driver's license, and documents showing ownership of the property. He held everything out for the officers to inspect. His hands remained steady. His expression revealed nothing. It was the same expression he had carried through military briefings involving dangers far greater than anything unfolding on his lawn. The supervising officer barely examined the paperwork. His attention appeared more focused on the crowd gathering across the street than on the evidence directly in front of him. Terrence then pressed the remote attached to his belt. The garage door rose smoothly. Inside was a perfectly organized space, filled with tools, a workbench, and the carefully folded American flag Terrence normally kept private. Rather than accepting this as obvious evidence that Terrence belonged there, one of the officers suggested that the garage remote might have been stolen along with the keys. The explanation made little logical sense, but it fit the suspicion already dominating the scene. From her porch, Laurel called out that she was certain the man could not possibly own such a large and beautifully maintained home. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who mistook instinct for evidence. Several neighbors nodded. Whispers traveled down the sidewalk. Terrence remained silent. He watched everything unfold with the detached patience of a man who had endured far worse than public suspicion, and had learned long ago that not every battle should be fought in the moment. He did not shout. He did not argue. He did nothing that might later be twisted into justification for what happened next. The supervising sergeant finally decided he had heard enough. With a short motion toward the other officers, Sergeant Brent Lawson ordered Terrence to turn around and place his hands behind his back. Cold metal closed around Terrence's wrists. The sharp click of the handcuffs seemed to echo along the quiet street. For the first time, something flickered briefly across Terrence's face. Then, the emotion disappeared beneath his usual control. I did not resist. I did not pull away. I gave the officers no excuse to escalate. Terrence understood with painful clarity that resistance would only make the situation more dangerous for a man who looked like him. As the handcuffs tightened, more neighbors came outside. Phones rose into the air. People began recording the sight of a large black man being restrained on the front steps of his own home. Terrence lowered his eyes briefly. Not because he was ashamed, because he was trying to control emotions he had every right to feel. Then he raised his head again. Steady, composed, a morning that had begun with nothing more complicated than mowing the lawn had transformed into a test of every ounce of discipline Terence had developed throughout his life. The officers guided him onto the top step of his own porch, the handcuffs pressed painfully against his wrists. Neighbors gathered along the sidewalk as though watching some strange public trial. Phones continued recording. Teenagers from nearby houses joined the growing crowd, capturing footage that would later circulate with captions none of them would be proud of. A man across the street shouted something mocking about people pretending to own things that were not theirs. An uncomfortable ripple of laughter passed through part of the crowd. Terence kept looking forward. His spine remained straight even while sitting in handcuffs. He refused to allow the metal restraints or the whispers around him to bend the posture he had carried through far greater trials. Terence understood that dignity was not a performance for an audience. It was a discipline maintained even when the audience believed you did not deserve it. Still, the weight of dozens of judgmental eyes pressed against him in a way no physical burden ever had. One of the officers asked Terence what he did for a living. Perhaps the officer was trying to make conversation. Perhaps he was testing him. Terence simply answered that he was retired. The officer asked where he had worked before retirement. Terence replied without embellishment, "The military." Another officer nearby laughed skeptically. He remarked that everyone suddenly claimed to have served in the military whenever such a story became convenient. Terence did not correct him. He did not become angry. He did not provide additional evidence beyond what he had already shown. He understood that some minds had closed themselves long before evidence ever arrived. So he remained seated, handcuffed, silent, absorbing an insult that cut much deeper than any of the officers realized because of the decades of real sacrifice contained inside the simple statement he had made. Around him, neighbors continued whispering about who this supposed stranger might really be. Some wondered what crime he had actually committed. Laurel stood near the front of the crowd. The certainty in her expression had begun slowly changing into doubt, although she was not yet prepared to admit it, even to herself. She told herself that she had made the telephone call in good faith. Yet, something about Terence's calm dignity, as he sat restrained on his own porch, did not match the frightening picture she had described to the dispatcher. Laurel pushed the thought away. The police would discover the truth, she told herself. This was simply the system working as it was supposed to. Other neighbors traded theories. Perhaps Terence was a repairman who had crossed a line. Maybe he was a sophisticated con artist examining homes in the area. Almost nobody considered the simplest possibility. The quiet man who kept to himself might simply be exactly who he claimed to be. The sun continued climbing overhead, indifferent to the injustice unfolding beneath it. Then a deeper engine sound reached the street. It was noticeably different from the patrol cars idling along the curb. Heads turned. A dark, unmarked military SUV rounded the corner onto Maple Ridge Lane. It moved with an unhurried authority that immediately seemed out of place among ordinary suburban houses. The vehicle approached the crowd. Tinted windows revealed nothing about whoever was inside. Several police officers exchanged uncertain glances. Terence remained seated on the porch step with his hands cuffed behind him. At the sound of the approaching vehicle, he lifted his head slightly. A flicker of recognition passed through his otherwise controlled expression. The whispers gradually disappeared as the SUV stopped directly in front of Terrence's house. Its engine continued running. The entire street seemed to pause. Nobody yet understood how completely the next moments were about to change what they believed. The rear door opened. A broad-shouldered man wearing a colonel's uniform stepped onto the pavement. His posture commanded immediate attention. Several police officers instinctively straightened. The colonel's eyes moved across the scene. The patrol cars, the gathering of neighbors. Then Terrence, sitting on his own porch in handcuffs. The composure the colonel had carried from the vehicle vanished the instant he recognized Terrence. Shock crossed his face, then barely restrained anger. He strode forward without hesitation. His voice cut through the quiet street as he demanded to know who had ordered this particular man restrained. The officers stumbled over their answers. They looked toward one another. Suddenly, nobody appeared eager to take responsibility for a decision that was beginning to unravel before them. Watching the colonel's reaction, Laurel felt something cold settle deep inside her stomach. For the first time, she began to understand that she might have made a terrible mistake. Before anyone could answer the colonel properly, another engine sounded from down the street. Every head turned again. This time, a long, black limousine bearing military markings slowly entered Maple Ridge Lane. It carried a deliberate weight that made it impossible to mistake for an ordinary vehicle. It stopped behind the SUV. The remaining whispers disappeared completely. The colonel turned toward the limousine. His posture immediately became even more rigid. The officers, who had seemed so confident before now, shifted uneasily. Terrence remained seated. He watched the limousine calmly. Something in his eyes suggested that, unlike everyone else, he already understood what was about to happen. The street seemed to hold its breath. The rear door opened. A tall man stepped out. 4 silver stars gleamed on his uniform. The effect was immediate. Every police officer at the scene straightened automatically. Training overrode the confidence that had guided their earlier actions. The colonel snapped to attention. His hand rose into a precise salute. There could be no misunderstanding about the importance of the man who had just arrived. The 4-star general barely acknowledged the officers. He did not study the crowd. He did not pause to survey the neighborhood. His eyes remained fixed entirely on Terrence Whitaker, sitting handcuffed on the steps of his own home. The general crossed the lawn with long, purposeful strides. Urgency was visible in every movement. Nobody standing on Maple Ridge Lane had ever witnessed anything like it. The silence became almost unbearable. Sergeant Lawson, the officer responsible for ordering Terrence restrained, felt his stomach tighten. He had spent much of his career believing he could assess situations quickly. That confidence had caused him to dismiss every piece of evidence Terrence had calmly provided. Now he watched a 4-star general cross the lawn with unmistakable urgency toward the very man he had ordered placed in handcuffs. With sickening clarity, Lawson began to understand how badly he had misjudged everything. He glanced toward Sierra Delgado. The rookie had questioned the decision earlier. He could not meet her eyes. The other officers shifted uncomfortably. Their certainty vanished with every step the general took, and they were beginning to understand that words would not undo what had already happened. For the first time since the patrol cars arrived, Maple Ridge Lane was completely silent. The general reached Terrence. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he knelt directly in front of him so they were at eye level. When the general spoke, his voice was low. There was something in it that sounded almost like grief. He apologized for making Terrence wait. There was none of the formality people might expect from an officer of such extraordinary rank, speaking to someone he had supposedly just encountered. Terrence simply nodded. His expression softened slightly. It was the subtle recognition of old friends who did not need many words to bridge the distance between them. The general sharply turned toward the nearest police officer. He ordered the handcuffs removed immediately. His voice carried an authority that required no explanation. No debate. The officers fumbled for the key. The cuffs finally opened. They fell away from Terrence's wrists with a metallic sound that seemed impossibly loud against the stunned silence. In that instant, the entire atmosphere of Maple Ridge Lane changed. Suspicion became disbelief. Judgment became shame. Terrence quietly rubbed his freed wrists. The general remained beside him, seemingly unconcerned with the growing crowd of neighbors staring openly. Then, the general began speaking. His words were directed toward Terrence, but his voice was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. I explained exactly who the man sitting before them truly was. Terrence had once commanded some of the most dangerous special operations of the general's career, missions that had saved hundreds of soldiers who otherwise might never have returned home. The general explained that Terrence had repeatedly declined opportunities for advancement, choosing to remain beside the people in his unit, instead of accepting safer positions farther away from the front lines. He spoke about the decorations Terrence had earned, honors that few soldiers received even across an entire career, awards recognizing acts of courage. Terrence had never once mentioned to anyone on Maple Ridge Lane. The same crowd that had mocked and doubted him now stood in humbled silence. The general continued. His voice became quieter, but no less firm. After retiring from active service, Terrence had refused nearly every honor and privilege offered to him. He chose a quiet life away from attention. No interviews, no public storytelling about his past, no search for the recognition many others might have welcomed after such a career. The general gave a faint, weary smile. He admitted that he had once served directly beneath Terrence, when he himself had been a younger officer still learning what real leadership looked like. Terrence had taught him that command was not measured by medals or rank. Real command, the general said, was measured by a person's willingness to carry burdens quietly so others would not have to. At the edge of the crowd, Laurel felt her earlier certainty collapse completely. Heat rose into her face. Shame replaced confidence. Around her, the officers who had placed Terrence in handcuffs stood frozen. Only now were they beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had done. The general then spoke about one particular mission from long ago. A convoy under his command had been ambushed in brutal terrain, far from any realistic hope of rapid rescue. Terrence, leading a small special operations unit, guided wounded and terrified soldiers through the chaos. He refused to leave until every person was accounted for and brought to safety. Several soldiers survived directly because of decisions Terrence made during that mission. Those same decisions could easily have cost Terrence his own life. The general's voice caught slightly as he remembered. The event remained vivid even after all that had passed since then. He said he carried its lesson through every promotion that followed. Real leadership meant staying when staying was hardest. It did not mean simply giving orders from a safe distance. The officers, who had been so quick to dismiss Terrence, now listened without looking away. They were discovering an entirely different man from the one they believed they had understood. Afterward, the local police department began reviewing everything that had happened. Security footage from cameras throughout the neighborhood was collected. A camera mounted at another house showed Terrence arriving at his own property that morning, exactly as he normally did. Property records were examined. They confirmed that Terrence Whitaker legally owned the house at number 14 Maple Ridge Lane. There were no irregularities connected to the deed. Investigators also determined that the original report of a suspicious break-in had been based entirely on assumption. The caller had offered no actual evidence of criminal activity. When officers were questioned individually, several admitted that they had almost immediately dismissed Terrence's explanations and the physical evidence he provided. Their decisions had been influenced more heavily by his appearance than by anything he said or did. Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation. At last, the questions stopped focusing on Terrence. They turned instead toward the decisions that had caused his humiliation. Laurel could not stop remembering Terrence sitting handcuffed on his own porch. His calm face returned to her thoughts again and again. The memory became heavier as she understood what she had done. At the time, Laurel had convinced herself that she was protecting her new neighborhood. Now, she understood that her fear had been based on nothing except the color of Terrence's skin and the work clothes he happened to be wearing. News traveled quickly through Maple Ridge Lane. Neighbors who had witnessed the incident talked to those who had not. Some openly expressed regret. They admitted that they too had assumed the worst, without asking even one simple question. Others remained defensive. They argued that anyone might have reacted the same way under the circumstances, but their voices no longer carried the certainty they had possessed before. Beneath every reaction remained one unavoidable truth. A man who had spent his life protecting other people had been treated as a threat by the very community he had quietly chosen as his home. The story soon reached local reporters. The account of a decorated veteran being handcuffed outside his own house spread far beyond Maple Ridge Lane. The police chief personally came to Terrence's home. There were no cameras, no publicity. The chief chose instead to have a quiet conversation on the same porch where the humiliation had occurred. He formally apologized on behalf of the department. He acknowledged that the responding officers had failed to follow proper procedure. Assumption had been allowed to replace basic investigation. Terrence listened patiently. His expression remained as calm as ever. He thanked the chief for coming in person, rather than sending a written statement through an office. The military released its own short but firm confirmation of Terrence's service record. Everything the four-star general had said on the lawn was verified. Around the neighborhood, several residents who had filmed mocking videos during the arrest quietly deleted them. They could no longer watch the footage without confronting the sting of their own judgment. Veterans from the surrounding area began visiting Terrence. Some traveled considerable distances, simply to shake his hand and thank him for service, whose true extent they had only recently discovered. Terrence welcomed every visitor with the same humility he had shown throughout the ordeal. He offered coffee, conversation, nothing more dramatic. He refused opportunities to publicly criticize individual officers. Reporters requested interviews, hoping to transform his experience into a spectacle of outrage. Terrence declined. When one journalist pressed him to condemn the police department forcefully, Terrence offered a simple response. Honor did not require applause, and nothing he had done in his life had ever been done for recognition. Many people were surprised by his restraint. Those who had come to understand him, however, realized that his calm was simply part of who he had always been. It did not mean he felt no pain. It meant discipline had taught him to choose dignity over vengeance. Among the veterans who eventually arrived at Terrence's home was Franklin Hayes, a gray-haired man who walked with a slight limp. Franklin had served under Terrence during the same operation the general had described. He stood on the porch for a long moment before finding the strength to speak. His voice thickened with emotion. He told Terrence that he now had a grown daughter. She was married. She had children of her own. None of them, Franklin said, would exist if Terrence had not carried him out of a ravine during that mission. Terrence invited him inside. The two men spent hours drinking coffee and exchanging quiet memories they had not spoken about in a very long time. The memories belonged to the small circle of people who had survived those events together. Franklin admitted that he had followed news of what happened online. Seeing his former commander humiliated on his own porch had filled him with an anger he had not expected to feel after so much time. Terence listened. When Franklin finished, Terence simply told him that anger was a fair reaction. But experience had taught him that anger was rarely the response that changed anything for the better. Franklin left with a promise to return. He kept that promise. Other old friends from Terence's military life also gradually found their way back into his world. Later, a community meeting was organized inside the gymnasium of the local elementary school. Far more people attended than anyone expected. Police representatives stood before the community and publicly admitted that their procedures had failed. They acknowledged weaknesses in training that had allowed bias to influence decisions that should have been based solely on evidence. The department announced new training specifically focused on recognizing and correcting unconscious assumptions. Officials said they hoped the changes would prevent another person from experiencing what Terence had experienced. Laurel remained near the back of the room through much of the meeting. Eventually, she found enough courage to walk forward. She stood before the community. Her voice trembled. Laurel apologized directly to Terence. She admitted that her fear had come from appearance and assumption alone. She deeply regretted the pain caused by her telephone call. Terence stood. He walked toward her. Then, he accepted the apology with a simple nod. He told Laurel quietly that he carried no anger toward her. He only hoped she had learned something from what happened. The room became silent as Terence turned toward the rest of the audience. His voice was steady, unhurried. It carried the same calm authority that had once guided soldiers through seemingly impossible circumstances. Terence told them that the most important thing was not finding one person to blame. What mattered was understanding what the entire community could learn from something that never should have happened. Judging people by appearance, he explained, was an old and familiar wound. It had shaped his own life in ways many people inside that gymnasium would never completely understand. But Terence also spoke about hope. Real change, he said, did not come from punishment alone. It came when people repeatedly chose to see one another more clearly. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. They were not moved by anger. There was no spectacle. They were moved by the quiet grace of a man who had every reason to become bitter and had chosen instead to teach. After the meeting, Officer Sierra Delgado waited near the door until the crowd surrounding Terence had begun to thin. She approached him quietly. Sierra admitted that she had sensed something was wrong during the encounter, but she had not felt confident enough to challenge her superior more strongly. She regretted not doing more to prevent what happened. Terence studied the young officer. He recognized the hesitation. It reminded him of the uncertainty young service members often experienced during their first genuine test of moral courage. He told Sierra that noticing wrongdoing and lacking the authority or confidence to stop it was not the same thing as causing the wrongdoing. What mattered now was what she chose to do with that discomfort. Terence encouraged her to trust the instinct she had shown. Such an instinct, he explained, was rarer and more valuable than she probably understood. Sierra thanked him. The conversation stayed with her. She later became directly involved in rewriting portions of the department's training manual, using what had happened on Maple Ridge Lane as motivation to push for meaningful change. The military eventually organized a small private ceremony. Terence made clear that he wanted no additional medals. The gathering was not meant to decorate him again. It was simply an acknowledgement of a lifetime of service that had remained almost completely unknown to the community where he now lived. A modest group gathered in a quiet hall. Former soldiers, military officers, a small number of close neighbors, the same four-star general who had knelt in front of Terence on his porch stood to speak. He told the room that some people defended their country while wearing a uniform. Others continued defending its honor long after the uniform had been removed. Terence Whitaker, he said, unquestionably belonged to the second group. In retirement, Terence had no longer guarded a military base or a battlefield. Instead, he had guarded something less visible, the quiet standard of what integrity was supposed to look like. The room applauded warmly. Terence appeared almost uncomfortable with the attention. He shifted in his chair, as though he would much rather have been at home working in his garden. When the gathering ended, Terence stepped outside into the afternoon light and declined offers for a ride. He preferred a few quiet moments alone with his thoughts. He drove home along familiar roads. He passed the school where the community meeting had taken place. Then, he returned to Maple Ridge Lane, the same street whose residents had once looked at him with such suspicion. As Terence pulled into his driveway, he noticed neighbors outside watering plants and walking their dogs. This time, nobody turned away. Nobody offered the stiff, uncertain nods he remembered. People stopped what they were doing. They stood a little straighter, one after another. Neighbors lifted their hands in simple greetings. Small gestures, yet they carried more weight than words. Terence raised his hand in return. He offered the same quiet smile he had always offered. Everything that had happened had not changed him. He parked his pickup, stepped into the evening air, then walked toward the garage to retrieve his lawnmower. The grass still needed cutting. Life on Maple Ridge Lane gradually returned to something quieter after the storm that had briefly swept through it. It was not exactly the life Terence had known before. Laurel began occasionally visiting with a plate of cookies or a cutting from her garden. Neither of them directly discussed what those gestures meant. They did not need to. Both understood that they represented a slow, continuing attempt at repair. The police department invited Terence several times to speak with new recruits about the incident that had changed departmental policy. He declined most invitations. He accepted a few. Whenever he did, he insisted that the conversations remain small and unrecorded. Terence never used the meetings to humiliate any individual officer. He focused instead on the deeper lesson. A badge, like a military uniform, carried a responsibility that had to be earned again every single day it was worn. Franklin became a regular visitor at Terence's home. Other old friends from his military career also gradually returned to his life as word traveled among veterans who had once served beside him. Something that had begun as one of the most humiliating experiences of Terence's life unexpectedly became a bridge back toward people and memories he had quietly set aside. Eventually, the story disappeared from the news. New headlines replaced it. Other events captured people's attention. But on Maple Ridge Lane, something permanent had changed. It was harder to measure than a headline, but far more lasting. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid Terence now stopped to talk. Sometimes they discussed nothing more meaningful than the weather. Sometimes gardening. Ordinary conversations, the kind that once would have seemed impossible. Terence almost never mentioned what had happened unless somebody else raised the subject. Even then, his answers remained brief. I was far more interested in moving forward than dwelling on something that could not be undone. Terence understood better than most that real change rarely announced its arrival. It came quietly, through small gestures, repeated again and again. Trust had to be rebuilt the same way. one honest moment at a time. And so Terence continued mowing his lawn. He continued greeting his neighbors, whether they greeted him first or not. He continued living the same disciplined and unassuming life he had always lived. Deep down, he trusted that the truth of who a person really was eventually found its way into the light, even when the world was painfully slow to recognize it. One evening, Terence worked slowly across his lawn while the sun dipped toward the rooftops of Maple Ridge Lane. Golden light caught the edges of the American flag folded carefully on a shelf inside his open garage. From her porch, Laurel watched him for a moment. There was no suspicion in her eyes now, only something approaching quiet respect. Then she turned and went back inside. No words were necessary. The street settled into evening. Ordinary sounds filled an ordinary neighborhood. The hum of Terence's lawnmower gradually disappeared as he finished his work. For a moment, he stood alone in his own yard and looked toward the houses surrounding him, toward people who now saw him differently than they had before. Terence had never wanted applause, and applause was not what he received. Only a quiet, steady acknowledgement, one that had taken far too long to arrive. As twilight settled across Maple Ridge Lane, the flag inside his garage moved gently in the evening breeze, a small reminder of something Terence had understood throughout his life. True honor asks for nothing, and yet, somehow, it always finds its way into the light.